Welcome, everybody, to our webinar presented by the Zionist Organization of America and the Greater Philadelphia chapter of the Zionist Organization of America. Hello, my name is Steve Feldman. I'm the Executive Director of Greater Philadelphia ZOA. And good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. I hope everybody tuning in today is well, you and your loved ones. And hope you're in good health and wish you all continued good health. Today's event is sponsored by an anonymous donor who has been very generous to our chapter, and we thank that individual very much. I also want to thank at this time my colleagues Alan J. and Jackie Schaefer, who are working behind the scenes to make this a smooth event today. Thank both of them, and I want to also thank all my other colleagues who are tuned in today, and the entire ZOA team, as well as our local and national leadership for being here and all that you do on behalf of the organization. Thank you so much. I want to remind everyone that ZOA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that engages in education, advocacy, and outreach on behalf of Israel, Zionism, the Jewish community, and the U.S.-Israel relationship. And if time permits, later on, we will take questions from the audience. You could put them in the Q&A tab. Just click on there if you have a question, and we'll try and get to them a little later in the event. And I want to point out that this event is dedicated to the memory of Lee Bender. Lee was one of our past presidents, and the second anniversary of his yahrzeit is next week. Our guest today is Dan Diker. Dan is one of the sharpest, clearest analysts on the scene today when it comes to the Middle East. He serves as project director for the program to counter political warfare and BDS at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. JCPA is one of the most important think tanks, and I use that term tank in both senses of the word, a container for information and a vehicle that works offensively and defensively. JCPA is really one of the great institutions in Israel. Dan is also a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, and he is a former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress. Do I have to refer to you as General, Dan?
Pretty neo-Marxist, that's the problem. So they changed the title to CEO.
Okay, but it's my honor and privilege to have this conversation that we're about to embark on with Dan Diker. Dan, welcome from, I think you're in Jerusalem joining us?
I'm joining you from Efrat in Gush Etzion, where I live, but also greetings from Jerusalem, where we work.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event today. The impetus for this event was really sparked by a column that you had in the Jerusalem Post earlier this month, and we'll get the link in the chat. And it really set off some thoughts of in my mind about one aspect of the war that's being waged against the Jewish people, which is what is passed off as political criticism, yet really is not political criticism. Dan, why don't we start there with the difference between what's legitimate, what's not, and what constitutes legitimate criticism of Israel.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you and the family at ZOA, the oldest American Zionist organization. And I'm sure that back in 1897, when ZOA was founded, we never would have dreamed about having this conversation. As the founding of ZOA came on the heels of the Judenstaat and the whole notion of modern political Zionism, the Jewish people returning to the land of Israel and reclaiming their rights for the third time in history. Well, here we are so many years later, 120 some odd years later, and we're having a discussion about what I think is really one of the most important issues for the Jewish community and the larger diplomatic and political community, as well as media, which is this conflation, or I would call it the masquerading of modern anti-Semitism as the masquerading of modern anti-Semitism as political criticism. Political criticism, as Professor Asa Kasher the IDF ethicist and the winner of the Israel Prize, notes to us that political criticism would be raw fact, stripped of any hyperbole, made about any particular political or diplomatic reality, without hyperbole, without name calling, but within a social, historical, and legal context, well argued, well reasoned, and also taking into account both the advantages or disadvantages, the good and less good qualities of any particular political state of affairs or decision. Well, that's not exactly what we're facing today. In a world in which Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, Steve, and our friends at ZOA, is the only country in the 193 member UN system that is commonly, routinely, and regularly referred to as a genocidal, apartheid, Nazi ethnic cleanser, and one of that engages in systematic racism against Palestinian people. I mean, this type of nomenclature is not applied to the worst violators of human rights and the greatest advocates and supporters of terror, like the Iranian regime and their Hezbollah terror proxies, Hamas terror proxies, the Taliban, who would be an appropriate example, and their affiliates at Al-Qaeda. And the atrocities that are going on around the world don't merit the type of nomenclature that Israel is unfairly targeted with. So we are so far from political criticism. In fact, I would argue that virtually no political criticism is leveled at Israel. But as Bernard Lewis has said, it's a type of ideological warfare, of ideological and political hatred that has become de rigueur in the international community, because racial anti-Semitism and religious anti-Semitism have been for so many decades, certainly since the Holocaust, racial anti-Semitism has not been countenanced by the international community, politically incorrect. So as so many great Jewish leaders, including the extraordinary Rabbi Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory, said that it's just the way to hate Jews is to hate the Jewish state today.
I'm reminded, Dan, of a meme that I saw a year or two ago that featured a very well-known personality, and the slogan under that person's image was, "It's you they're after, but I'm just in the way." It seems like from what we know and from what you've just said that it's the Jewish people that they're after, and Israel is "quote unquote" just in the way. Would you concur and elaborate on that?
Oh, I think that's very well put, Stephen. I think that if we notice what happened in July of 2020, when George Floyd, a Black American, was killed while in custody, there was one community in the United States that, from left to right, from Reform to Orthodox, condemned that killing, that police brutality. It was the Jewish people. And what we saw almost coterminously, simultaneously, was a violent outbreak of anti-Semitic assault against Jews from Los Angeles to Manhattan to Brooklyn to Chicago to cities in Washington, that simply didn't make sense. But it is a proof text for what you've just said, is that they were using pretexts about Israel in order to attack Jews, while the Jewish community, from wall to wall across the board in the United States, was the one community to condemn this act of violence, in an ironclad way. So it was that sort of frontal collision, that disconnect between our great sympathy for what had happened to Mr. Floyd with the violence and almost I would call it urban terror that took American cities by storm and targeted the Jewish people. As you could see, the graffiti on a lot of the Bate Knesset, the synagogues in different cities, would said,
F-U-C-K Israel and liberate Palestine. That was the, if you put it in a microcosm, that is exactly what happened, and Jews in the United States were the targets.
I want to just remind our audience, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A. There is a tab on your screen as part of Zoom where you could post your questions, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can if time permits towards the end of our event today. Dan, you mentioned some of the slogans that are levied against Israel / the Jewish people: ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid, and even occupied. They're all demonstrably false, and yet they all seem to stick. Why, in your opinion, is that something that is so obviously false? The most basic of statistics prove them false, and yet they stick. They make headlines. They're uttered at demonstrations and on signs and etc. Why is that?
Well, Steve, I want to just pick up on something you just said, which actually is a very interesting moment. You said they're all false, and we can prove that they're false. It would be like saying that Jew hatred is false, or it would be like saying, should we consider that anti-Semitism might be true or false? The buzzwords that have dominated the international diplomatic, political, media, and NGO discourse are buzzwords like Jews as ethnic cleansers, Israel as apartheid, Israel as Nazi, Israel as genocidal, Israel as colonialistic, Israel as systemically racist, Israel as engaging in as Judge Goldstone had said before he apologized back in the war opposite Hamas, the first of 3 wars, back in 2009-10, he called Israel intentionally killing Gaza civilians before he apologized in the New York Times for that frankly anti-Semitic behavior. Right. So it's not a question of true and false. It's a question of why these anti-Semitic slurs, and they all are anti-Semitic. If you look at the definitions of anti-Semitism, which is vitally important for this phone call, for this Zoom call, we have noticed that these terms, and I'm sure many of the people engaging with us tonight have noticed really, I would say, as far back as 1975, during the infamous Zionism is Racism UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, that determined at Yasser Arafat's insistence and convinced the General Assembly at that time, not including the free countries, the free powers of the West, that Zionism is racism. And if Zionism is racism and racism is a crime, then Zionism was a crime. Well, that notion of the criminality of Zionism, which Dr. Fiamma Nirenstein, who was the deputy head of the Italian Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Parliament, she's today an Israeli and she works at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. She just published a monograph called Double Message, Double Standard. She calls that, from 1975, that moment until today, the Nazification of Israel, which is that Israel does to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to us. And that was, frankly, that was embodied in this Zionism is racism pronouncement, which has stuck with us and served as I would call it the substructure, or the substructure of hate and rejection of the very notion of the nation state of the Jewish people. So that criminality of Israel, the demonization of Israel, is really what guides the normalized discussion in the United Nations today since the 1970s, in the diplomatic discourse, among countries in Europe, and certainly if you go to any university campus, you will, I'm talking about the 250 university campuses in North America, in which there's an organization called Students for Justice in Palestine. Well, the Students for Justice in Palestine would be better named Students for the Destruction of Israel. SDI, not SJP, because they do nothing to help the Palestinians, but do everything in order to attack Israel and to try to undermine Israel's very legitimacy as a nation state in the UN system. So
all of these buzzwords began to stick, and none of them have even an ounce of truth to them, and none of them are used but any other country but Israel. So that, by the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance 2016 working definition of anti-Semitism, which I urge everyone on this call to review again and again and again, holds that any of the language that we've just discussed, Israel is apartheid, Israel is a Nazi, Israel is genocidal, Israel is racist, is blatantly anti-Semitic by the IRA definition, which has been accepted by the entire EU 27, foreign minister of the 27 countries of the European Union, as well as the United States, Canada, the English-speaking countries, as well as in countries in Latin America. So I strongly urge us all to review again and again and again that IRA working definition, which is not a legal definition, but it's an accepted working definition, a moral mandate by the international community to give us some moral clarity on this issue by starting out with the right definition that would cancel out all the buzzwords we just used.
That is absolutely important. And again, I want to remind people to please use the Q&A function in this event if you have a question, not the chat room. The chat room is not for questions. Dan, we find more and more Jews, especially younger Jews, using some of the terminology that our enemies use that you and I have been discussing today. Do they realize, in your opinion, that what's going on and that by using them, they are becoming tools of our enemies?
That's an excellent question, Stephen. And I think that, again, these terms, many people, I remember as a 15-year-old tennis player in apartheid South Africa in 1976, when the members of Soweto, the ghetto just outside of Johannesburg, began the march, the historic march from Alexandria and Soweto into Johannesburg. I witnessed, as I would assume some people on this call did, what real apartheid is. And then what has happened is that word, let's use that word as a microcosm of the entire problem, has been weaponized, twisted beyond any reasonable definition of what actually it was, which was an expression of white minority superiority, enshrined in South African law until 1994. And that has somehow, in the name of human rights, and with this, j'accuse Ken Roth and Omar Shakir and these so-called self-described human rights warriors at Human Rights Watch, which have done a terrible disservice to the people of South Africa, a terrible disservice to the victims of real apartheid, and they have engaged in anti-Semitic rhetoric against Jews in the Jewish state by even using the word in a May 2021 propaganda report, accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. But what happens to your question is that young people who don't remember, who don't know what apartheid was, as an example, they find it normalized on university campuses. Let's remember that the Israel Apartheid Week has become, next to the Super Bowl, one of the best attended week-long carnivals of hatred. Not that the Super Bowl is a carnival of hatred, but just in terms of its popularity, that takes place every single year for at least a week on university campuses around North America. So how do we expect young people to believe anything but Israel is an apartheid state? And if Israel is an apartheid state, let me just remind us all, apartheid was one of the two evils of the 20th century. And Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership wanted to make sure that the Jewish people in their nation state, as Zionists, would be branded as the third evil of the 20th century and the first evil of the 21st century, to be eliminated by the international community. Now, young people, especially, and Jews, want to be part of the American idiom, the American mainstream, social pressure, social acceptance, and we're living in a world in the United States where words like equality, justice, and peace are the flagship words, or the slogan of what? Of the BDS movement itself. Look at the
look at the homepage of the BDS movement, and you see those 3 words. Well, that's the kind of language that the Soviet Union used to use when, before they murdered tens of millions of people. They did it in the, under the nomenclature of justice, of equality, of peace. And so we're seeing this type of linguistic inversion in the United States, and it is capturing and kidnapping young Jews who have not studied, who don't have context and historical memory, and it's capturing, kidnapping them and holding them by the neck, and they're buying into it. And the professors on the university campuses, not a few of them who are Jews, ill-advised, misguided, and politically charged, are poisoning the environment and in a politicized way for young Jews across North America, which is why the work, frankly, of the ZOA is so terribly important these days in order to recreate moral clarity where today there is very little.
But Dan, these, whether it's young Jews or not so young Jews who use these terminologies and repeat them, they really, I guess, have no idea that they have become a tool, as I call them, in the hands of our enemies. How many times have we seen at a anti-Israel event, somebody who was purported to be Jewish holding a sign that says, for example, "One more Jew against the occupation." They really seem to have no idea that the harm that they're doing to their own people.
They don't see it as harm, Steve. They see it as virtue. In other words, I'll give you an example. One of the, if you go on to the website of the BDS movement, they will say that the BDS fights anti-Semitism as it fights Zionism. And this has been the new, I would say, the progressive Einhart approach of being a good Jew, is to differentiate between Israel as what they see as a sort of a political problem that need not exist, and being a good Jew, which is being a Jew of universal values, which makes you part of sort of this universal community of good people. Whereas Israel represents, as the Durban Conference, as we approach in another 2.5 weeks, the 20 years since the Durban Carnival, since the Durban Conference in Durban, South Africa.
It's a carnival. I think you had it right, but go ahead.
Yeah, it is a carnival of hatred that thank God many Western countries have pulled out of already. I plan, by the way, and I'll let you know a secret, I plan to be in New York City with member of Knesset Gadi Yvarkan, who is the only Ethiopian Israeli member, male member of Knesset. We have a wonderful minister, Penina Tamano-Shata, who's the Minister of Aliyah and Absorption. But Gadi Yvarkan plans to take the war to the what I call the apartheid anti-Semites in New York on the 19th of September, and I plan to join him there so that we put the apartheid people on notice and on their heels, because they have to prove why they are not racists, as opposed to why Israel is not an apartheid state. But back to the point, let me just give you one more example.
Please. You
have in the Jewish community a major internal conflict. On May 17, 2019, Steve, a very important decision took place in the Bundestag, in the German parliament. For the first time, the German parliament determined that the BDS movement is demonstrably anti-Semitic. Now, this was an historic moment. It was both sponsored, supported, and vociferously endorsed by Chancellor Angela Merkel in a cross-party, left to right, cross-party resolution. Now, there were only two major sets of opponents worldwide to the historic decision of the Bundestag, determining that the BDS movement is demonstrably anti-Semitic. The labeling of Israeli products reminded them of what they called the Juden boycott in the 1930s. And one of those people was the Hamas. The Hamas Minister of Health came out in a major full-scale rhetorical assault against the Republic of Germany, and the other were 200 Jewish and Israeli academics who condemned the German decision as being discriminatory, bigoted against the Palestinians. Now, the fact is that you have Jewish and Israeli academics that are undermining themselves by opposing a German cross-party resolution is absolutely stunning. But from their point of view, so the question becomes, do they hate themselves as Jews? That's what people say. I would say not. I would say what I'd like to share with you is a nuance that is not known usually in the Western discourse. And that is that from their point of view, it's strictly a political policy issue, meaning BDS, meaning they would call themselves Zionist BDSers, which means that they are vociferously supportive of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people within certain borders called the 1949 armistice lines, otherwise known as the Green Line. Some of us know it as the 1967, the pre-1967 lines. So they have no intention of turning hatred inward or calling themselves self-hating Jews or calling for, any kind of full boycott of Israel. But the effect, as former Harvard President Larry Summers has said, is that though they don't have an intention, what they have done is to twin themselves with those who want to boycott and dismantle the entire state of Israel. So therefore, they are actually giving them 98 octane fuel in order to engage in the full boycott of Israel, while they, the Jews and Israelis who opposed the German decision, for example, only did so strictly from a strictly far left political position that ended up backfiring and smashing the entire Jewish people in the face. I hope I've made that clear. I'm more than happy to reiterate that example because it's extremely important to understand the collision that is taking place within the Jewish community, mostly where you are in North America, less in Europe, over the issue of these buzzwords and the anti-Semitic use of these anti-Semitic terms such as apartheid.
Dan, you mentioned Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch, of course, which has been one of the worst offenders of this movement to use Israel as a tool to get at the Jewish people. Can you go through some of the other big name or worst of these entities?
In the United States, which I'll stick with the U.S., you have a sliding scale of organizations and let's call them thought leaders. We start with Beinart, who called himself a liberal for many years, a very intelligent young man, professor of communications and journalism at the City University of New York. But from our point of view in Israel, and I think from your point of view, I'm sure, Steve, I speak for you and many other reasonable people, Peter is terribly ill-advised and terribly dangerous in the sense that he speaks cogently, he knows a lot, and he unfortunately twists what he knows into sort of quoting the Gemara, which is to say that, when the international community called for a national home for the Jewish people back at the beginning of the 20th century, without defining that it would be a state, he would say, well, that means that the Zionist answer could be a binational or a state that is not does not have a Jewish majority character. Well, the fact is that his positions align with with the Hamas. His positions align today with the PLO and the PA. Which is the PA today, by the way, it should be said here, are loyal to the 1968 the Palestine National Charter, which has never, ever been amended to call for the dismantling of Israel as an illegal implant in the Middle East. This has been one of the great international deceptions of modern times. And Israelis, I think, are coming to understand that it's been a deception. So when organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, some of these young people who grew up in liberal Jewish families, some of them Orthodox, others conservative, some Reconstructionists,
but all of them identified with Israel as the focus and the anchor of their Jewish identity, certainly from a family point of view, are now working against, the very anchor of Jewish identity for the last 70 years. So this is it's a very sad state of affairs. I'm not worried about Israel. I'm worried about young Jews in North America, where I grew up, a country, the United States, a country that I love, one of the greatest experiment of democracy and freedom in the world, that I believe today is going through a very difficult time, and one of also searching for identity and searching for searching for itself, if we might say. Not that Israel's also searching for itself. However, I will say this, that recently, you may know, Steve, and the rest of the ZOA family on this call, that when Ben and Jerry's decided to disassociate their moral values from Israel's moral values, 85 members of the Israeli parliament disavowed Ben and Jerry's. So I think that you see that there is no coalition and no opposition, as they say in Hebrew, en coalitia en oppositia, when it comes to an issue of the basic moral clarity in this against this war, this ideological war of Israel. This is a point I'd like to make if anybody's writing these things down, as I do when I go to these Zoom sessions. We are facing an ideological war against the existence of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. I can't say it any more clearly. This is why Ambassador Dr. Dori Gold allowed me to call the department that I had, the program against political warfare. We didn't choose that term lightly. We chose it with great intention. And those of you that remember the word active measures and the former Soviet Union know that we are facing massive disinformation that was rooted in the Soviet period, in which PLO leaders who are today in their 70s and 80s were studying in Cuba, in Hungary, in North Vietnam. They were learning this type of disinformation. And this type of disinformation that revealed itself at the UN and has continued internationally and is being driven by the BDS National Committee in Ramallah, by the way, in which 5 terror organizations sit with over 100 NGOs that are called human rights NGOs, have been advancing this ideological warfare against Israel, and now it has penetrated the minds of North America. So we are not talking about Hasbara. We are not talking about a territorial conflict. We are talking about Israel as being accused of being a white racist implant, even though you and I know that Israel is a brown country, not a white country. The majority of people do not come from Anglo-Saxon or white background. But beyond that, there are no parties to Israel's in a territorial conflict, but the PLO and its fellow travelers in the West are advancing an ideological conflict against Israel, not a territorial conflict. Very, very important distinction.
And I would say it's a war against the Jewish people, not only Israel. That's
by sure. No, Israel as the collective Jew.
Right.
I mean, Israel as an expression of the Jewish people.
Right. Dr. Diker, you've done a wonderful job diagnosing the problem. What are some of the treatments you would recommend for everybody watching? What can we do about this?
Well, first of all, I hope that some of you can join us in New York at the counter conference to counter and dismember apartheid anti-Semitism, which will be held at the Harvard Club on the 19th of September. I guess Corona willing, if you will, if we want to put it that way, see if we can all sort of gather there. That's one thing. Second thing I would really strongly suggest, we all have to get on the same intellectual page, moral page. If I may engage in a moment of self-promotion, because what I did when Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan came out with their statements in the beginning of 2019, Israel apartheid, Israel BDS apartheid, and some of the other choice language that we've used in the last half hour, I got to work on a research compendium, which you can see here, called Israelophobia and the West. It's the hijacking of civil discourse and on Israel and how to rescue it. This is a compendium. This is the most complete compendium of the differences between political critique and Political Anti-Semitism, written by some of the great thinkers in Israel and the Jewish world, such as Natan Sharansky, Professor Dershowitz of Harvard, Dori Gold, Professor Asa Kasher, and also Ethiopian and Black Americans, by the way, who side with Israel and who believe that the use of these terms is simply a form of racism and bigotry against Jews that are dressed up in and disguised as criticism against the Jewish state. So I would suggest that this is available online for free. You just put in Israelophobia in the West, and you can download the entire book for free. And the articles are well edited, I must say. They're brief and very much to the point. They talk about what political criticism is and what it is not. And the other book I would strongly urge that just came out last week is this book, as you can see, Double Message, Double Standards, International Institutions Abandoning the IRA Definition of Anti-Semitism and How They Court Danger, by Fiamma Nerenstein, who is a distinguished scholar at the Jerusalem Center, and she was the former deputy president of the Italian Foreign Affairs Committee. Great examples of the Nazification, the denial of Jewish sovereignty by using the word, by the way, illegal occupation, which we should talk about for half a minute, what
Please.
that means.
Please.
I'm sorry to have sort of spread out this in answering these questions, but behind the word apartheid has been the buzzword illegal occupation and OPT. OPT could go on your cufflinks, the occupied Palestinian territories. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say this as clearly as I can, and I say it with the full authority of the leading legal authorities in Israel. There is no such animal as the OPT. There is no legal, historical, diplomatic, or any other construction that is called the occupied Palestinian territory. Every time you hear that, you remind yourself that that is an act of political warfare that has been mainstreamed and normalized by the international diplomatic community. It has nothing to do with anything legal, moral, or true. And you can get, by the way, that information from Israelophobia, or you can come to the Jerusalem Center for jcpa.org, and you can read any of the articles by attorney Alan Baker, who was in Oslo. He is my colleague there, one of the great legal authorities in Israel. He was an Oslo negotiator, represented Israel at the United Nations in a legal capacity. But it's the use of that word that becomes normalized, that we're a criminal occupier of someone else's land. And that then evolves or devolves into this nomenclature of, apartheid and so on. You remember that was used and adopted by the NGO Forum at the end of the Durban 1, right? Back in 2001, 7 days before Osama bin Laden flew airplanes into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So, it's very important to remember there's no such thing as OPT. Point number 2, there is no such thing as illegal occupation. That does not exist. There's no such term. It is a political weapon that is being used against Israel. In fact, the political weaponry called illegal occupation is based on the concept, the term of art in international law called occupation, which is a term of art that, as many of you know, or many of us know, emanated from the former Nazi regime's occupation of sovereign Europe and the subsequent legal responsibilities according to international humanitarian law following the Nazi occupation of Europe, which was also followed, by the way, in a totally different context, with the American occupation of Imperial Japan at the end of World War II. But when people use the word occupation as a negative word and the non-existent term illegal occupation, they mean to compare Israel to Nazi Germany. Right. Let's be very clear what the point of reference is. And it goes back to the 1975 Zionism is racism smear, the libel, the slander that was used in order to racialize Israel the way the Nazi regime had racialized itself by choice, and the apartheid regime had racialized its superiority by choice. So let's understand those are the points of reference, were the two major examples of international evil in the 20th century. So when people use the term occupier, that's the point of reference, Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa, and the term illegal occupation does not exist.
Dan, in addition to joining you in New York and the books you mentioned, what are a couple easy steps that those of us watching live and who will watch a recording of this can do today, tomorrow, to try and lick this horrible problem?
The first thing we need to do is to engage, Steve, in holding our political representatives accountable. And that means in the House, I think, in our view in Israel, and I just discussed this with a senior member of a government ministry, we need to adopt a policy of zero tolerance for this type of language, this type of rhetorical and ideological warfare. Zero tolerance. And that means holding our elected representatives to account. It means educating ourselves. It means educating our elected representatives. It means writing op-eds. It means holding events. It means sponsoring podcasts. I mean, we are in this ideological war. Words are weapons, and what we've been doing is arming our enemies in order to kill us with that type of language by subscribing to the type of anti-Semitic libel and slander that our enemies use against us. So we have to arm ourselves with these distinctions and truth and understand what the policies are. We've got to understand. Everyone on this call has to understand that the root of the problem in the international community, in terms of the word for settlements, for example, by the way, and occupation came from a legal opinion that was issued by Herb Hansel in 1978 under the Carter administration.
Yeah.
Right? He had just passed away. Ambassador Hansel just passed away I think it was 2 years ago. But his opinion, which was a negative opinion, it's legitimate. I don't agree with him. Many of us don't agree with him, but it was a legitimate opinion that Israel's settlement policy violated the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. Well, everyone on this call has to learn what that opinion was. And then we've got to learn why former Secretary of State Pompeo and his jurist in the State Department held that Herb Hansel's opinion was wrong. And now we're getting to the essence of political criticism, because if you can weigh the two opinions, and then come up with a reasoned, contextual opinion ourselves, then we will really be armed with the truth. And that's when we can begin to disentangle and disarm these types of smears of rhetorical warfare against Israel. But until we do that, we can just get angry, annoyed, and nauseous, and we can't do anything about it. So we've really got to learn. We've got to learn, contemporary history. We've got to know that the roots of our modern diplomatic and historical rights are not in 1947, but the UN Special Committee on Palestine said a Jewish and an Arab state. It was in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which was then affirmed twice by the League of Nations. In fact, Israel is the only member of the 193-member UN system whose rights to sovereignty were twice affirmed. The only country. And isn't it ironic that we're the only country that's referred to as an apartheid state? So all this makes no sense, right? But if you begin to disentangle it, and if you begin to educate ourselves as to what recent diplomatic history was, even some biblical history, some legal history, and the legal tools, we can begin to disarm our opponents.
We are going to take a couple of questions from the audience, but before we do, I just want to remind everybody, you've heard some of the challenges today that our community faces, that Israel faces, and ZOA is hard at work on solving each of them, all of them. And you can help us not only to meet these challenges, but also to proactively help Israel and the Jewish community and advance Zionism by financially supporting our work. I want to encourage you to please make a donation. If you're in Eastern Pennsylvania, Southern New Jersey, Delaware, please donate to Greater Philadelphia ZOA. And if you live outside of those areas, please donate to and support your local chapter or national ZOA. I'm going to put the information in the chat room for everybody to do so, including our websites, both locally and nationally. And please help us to the best of your ability. The more support we get, financial support, participatory support from all of you, the more that ZOA can do to help our people together. We are in this together. There is no organization like ZOA that is as outspoken and takes on these challenges like we do under the leadership of our national president, Mort Klein. So please support our work. Dan, there was a wonderful question. Unfortunately, it says anonymous attendee. I'm not sure who to give this credit to. Pardon me, but the questioner asks or says, first of all, you're quite informed and powerful. So can you get people like Beinart, Mark Lamont Hill, Jeremy Ben-Ami, and others to debate with you? Have you tried? Have you engaged in any debates on these topics?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the feedback. The answer is, if you go on the internet, you can see in January 2020, Jeremy Ben-Ami and I debated in Tel Aviv. And I think that today I would debate Jeremy more aggressively than I did. You can find it online. It actually was a spirited debate. In the spirit of full disclosure, I will say that Jeremy and I were high school classmates at the collegiate school in New York, which is something you'll find that when you listen to the podcast. And you know, the reason I have a very big problem with J Street, even though J Street says that they're pro-Israel and pro-peace, and Jeremy has reiterated to me personally, and of course J Street institutionally, they do not support BDS. Well, in fact, I think they do support BDS, and I don't think they're pro-Israel and pro-peace, because I can't find any unconditional positive statements that they make about Israel's high tech, about the fact that Israel has become the solution for many Arab countries in the Middle East. We're sharing defense, security, water, agriculture, health, research and development to our neighbors here throughout the Middle East and the world. You find that J Street makes virtually no positive comments about Israel, but basically what they've done is they have trotted out the intractable Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a recruiting mechanism to get young Jews to join the left flank of the Democratic Party. That's what I think. I think that is J Street's political agenda. And I don't see Jeremy Ben-Ami taking on Beinart and telling him that he's dead wrong for not being pro-peace, pro-Israel. Nor do I see him taking on the Jewish Voice for Peace or other anti-Zionist, anti-Israel organizations. He defended the Human Rights Watch apartheid report, while very tactically, cautiously not calling Israel an apartheid state himself. But what I think that J Street has done is to cause a lot of hatred among young Jews towards the Jewish state, to distance them from the Jewish state. And I think that the fact that they have a lot of mainstream legitimacy, it causes a lot of trouble, and including from, you know, Israeli political mainstream centrist, politicians who want to reach out to J Street because they want to be relevant to the Jewish community. So they don't really understand, I think, why the last two ambassadors to Washington refused to meet J Street and don't recognize J Street, and why, frankly, J Street was not accepted into the Conference of Presidents, because I think they have a lot more proving to do before they can claim that they're pro-Israel, pro-peace.
And just as an aside, Mort Klein, our national president, had a successful debate with Jeremy Ben-Ami a few years ago also, just to point that out. Miriam Ellis asked a very good question, Dan. Why can't we bring this problem and these solutions to TV, whether it's on network TV, cable TV? It seems like we have these conversations amongst ourselves. Why can't we seem to get them before a larger audience of tens of thousands, millions of people?
I think that we do. I mean, I think that the social networks are the new, the social networks in 2021, were the NBCs of the 1970s and the CNNs of the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. And I think that what we need to do is to really get into the type of talk radio, podcasting, and I think we reach many more people directly. I think that one of the, I remember former Prime Minister Netanyahu's English language media advisor is a friend of mine, David Keyes, very brilliant young man, who for the first time was getting Netanyahu videos out there, and those videos, Steve, were scoring more popularity than the average CNN than the average CNN audience on a Monday, Tuesday, and a Wednesday. I think going directly to the people is the way to go here. Trying to get on mainstream television, is trying to convince Don Lemon, that Israel is virtuous, and it's just not going to happen. It may come out to keep the analogy, or it may come out bitter. So I think that I think that, or could we make lemonade, from right? So I think the issue is for all of us to go directly to our our friends and family in the Jewish community and in the larger community. We at the Jerusalem Center, I will say that I'm heading a project together with the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. It's called IBSI. They're a wonderful organization headed by Pastor.
The Washington family.
Yes, it is. Dumasani Washington and his son Joshua and his daughter-in-law Olga Meshwe Washington. Her father is a very proud and important member of the South African Parliament and a great friend of the Jewish people. And they're doing an incredible job. What we're doing together, by the way, as an initiative, is to identify and work with Black American young leaders, men and women, who are young educators and young leaders. Because what we need to do as a Jewish community is to get what I call third-party verifiers or allies who are, and I can't say it in any straighter language, but people of color. I know in the Hispanic community, in the Black community, in the Asian community, we have friends and allies, and we have got to get them fighting alongside us in this ideological war. Because I'll tell you, the Palestinian, the PLO affiliated political warfare warriors where you are, and I'm talking about Nora Arakat at Rutgers, I'm talking about Sari Magdisi at UCLA, I'm talking about Professor Hatem Bazian, who is the founder of Students for Justice in Palestine, a Palestinian expat who was a mid-level Hamas operative at American Muslims for Palestine. He is at Berkeley. You've got Joe Massad at Columbia. You've got Khalidi, calling Israel the evil of the 21st century, writing books and getting, he's of course Edward Said's
chair.
Chair at Columbia University. So we've got a tremendous amount of opposition, and these professors are not talking about two states for two people,
Right.
Steve Feldman. They're talking about eliminationism. They are leading the ideological war in the context of a postmodern critical race theory, environment in those universities that are poisoning, that are sending young Jews under their beds, getting others to stay silent, and while faculty members join them in trying to rout Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, a democratic, one of the leading democratic powers in the world. And actually what the Arab states are saying under Saudi Arabia sanctions, the solution to the Middle East, not the problem in the Middle East.
I want to add to your fine list of enemies in academia, Mark Lamont Hill of Temple University, who for us is a local problem that ZOA has worked very hard on identifying, calling out, and other things that we're working on related to him. So people should know about him, especially those in the Philadelphia region. Dan, I want to ask you a rather difficult question that you alluded to within the Jewish community. We've even got some rabbis down. We saw a despicable letter by seminary students attacking Israel with some of these false allegations. How important is it for all of us and others to talk to rabbis, to talk to cantors about this issue, so that they from the pulpit or through their leadership as clergy can disabuse the rest of the community of the fallacies of some of these accusations against Israel and Jewry?
That's a very important question, Steve. And let me, if I understand you correctly, you're talking about the rabbi's letter during the recent Iran-backed Hamas war, the rocket war against Israel. Let's just, for purposes of illustration, take 20 seconds and graphically outline what Steve Feldman has just said. The Iran-backed Hamas, which has become a de facto Sunni proxy of the Iranian regime, the leading supporter, financer, and director of international terrorism,
including in America's back door in Mexico and throughout Latin America, by the way, fired 4,300 rockets indiscriminately into kindergartens, synagogues, and residential areas. We in Efrat were very lucky because they don't want to hit Bethlehem and they don't want to hit other Arab areas that are our neighbors. So they didn't fire in our direction. They fired in the direction of the Sharon area, what they call the Sharon, the central region.
Right.
Now, the Hamas commit double war crimes, right? They hide behind their own women and children, including storing their weapons in mosques, in hospitals, especially Shifa Hospital in the middle of Gaza, in schools, and in UN compounds, as the former United Nations Secretary General has referred to. And rabbis actually are going to attack the Jewish state who have legal advisors in every division of the army before taking any military action. Israel, probably more than any other country in the world, has to consult with its legal advisors because we're constantly in a situation of urban warfare where there can be high casualties. So the question is, why were there so few casualties among the Palestinians when they were firing from within residential buildings? And at the same time, you know, this group of rabbis that have not been here, did not understand what was going on, took the liberty, basically, of legitimizing Hamas and delegitimizing Israel, which is just quite stunning as and I think intolerable. And I do think that people need to engage their rabbis, the men and women in the pulpits. Certainly people who are big supporters, financial supporters of their community, need to demand, put together roundtables and ask their rabbis to, for free and open discussion, or have what they call free and open political, diplomatic, current event discussions in their synagogues. I would also say that there should be a prohibition of rabbis politicizing from the pulpit their views if they take particular political views against Israel. I think that one has to be very careful about not politicizing their pulpits, as opposed to trying to teach Judaism from the, educate their communities, on a weekly, daily, or a weekly basis. Which is not to say that criticism is bad. Criticism is fine, but it has to be done in the context of well-reasoned, well-presented, raw facts, contextual analysis. And I also think that that those of us who are alumni of universities have to hold university faculty to account. It can't be more than any other American community. The Jewish community probably donates more money to the top 100 universities than the next 5 or 6 communities in the United States together. And the fact is that Mark Lamont Hill is able to basically take Hamas positions in Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress, where American democracy was born. Continental Congresses convened, and is able to spew that type of anti-Semitic propaganda without being called out by alumni and trustees, many of whom are I assume, are Jewish and friendly to Israel.
And many have called him out. Just to be clear, many have called him out, and we've really led that charge. We are running short on time. Dan, I want to thank you very much. As I said at the outset, you really are one of the clearest, sharpest analysts on these issues, and you've my billing for you proved true again today. So thank you very much. For joining us and spending the time. And I want to recommend that everybody follow you and your writings at JCPOA. And I believe
JCPOA is the Iran deal that we don't
right. I'm sorry, my bad. And you're on Twitter also. Where can people find you?
At Dan Diker 84, which is when I graduated from college. At Dan Diker 84 is my Twitter. I'd be delighted to engage with you on Twitter, or please email me at Diker, my last name, Diker, at jcpa.org. And please come. We have great briefs, as Steve, as you know, at jcpa.org. I'm actually writing one as we speak. I just finished before we came online, talking about the Taliban's Palestinian partners. You'll be very interested to see the level of engagement, affinity, and alliance between the Palestinian leaderships and the Taliban.
I want to take this opportunity to remind everybody of the importance of committing time and effort to advocacy and activism. I want to encourage everybody again to please support ZOA, whether locally in the Philadelphia region or nationally or in the chapter near where you live. Again, the information for supporting us and getting involved is in the chat. Please take advantage of that. I want to wish you and your loved ones, everybody watching, good health, Lashana Tova, and may you and they be inscribed for another year of good health and prosperity. Thank you all for watching, and have a good rest of the day.